Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jack Arnold's film Boss. I'm going to call it Boss because that is the title that Tubi has it listed under, which is where I watched it. And the proper name is Boss N-word, which I am not going to say. So, Jack Arnold's film Boss. This is a Blaxploitation Western from 1975, and it really follows a lot of the conventions of the sort of spaghetti Western pretty closely, but because it is also a Blaxploitation film, there's the sort of elements of Black empowerment that work kind of by subverting the continual racism in the film, right? So, the movie is about these two bounty hunters, Boss and Amos. Boss played by Fred Williamson, and Amos played by D'Urberville Martin. Amos, I actually think, is amazing. I think Amos is probably one of my favorite. He's my favorite character in this film, hands down. So they are bounty hunters. They are trying to get the bounty on this guy named Jed. Jed Clayton. And in order to do that, they basically have to go to this small town and become the sheriff and the deputy, because Jed Clayton, it's not so much that he runs the town, but that he basically has control over the mayor, and Jed and his gang frequently come into town, take whatever they want, harass, if nothing else, the local women. They kill people, etc., etc. And so the town is terrified of them. Boss and Amos are not terrified of them. So what you get, somewhat predictably, because this is a Western, is you get this series of tropes, right? So to a certain extent, we have the man with no name, right? Because he's called Boss, but we don't know that it's unlikely that that's what it would say on his birth certificate, for instance. It's possible, but presumably that is a nickname, or whatever it is. So we've got that element, that sort of man with no name element. We've got the anti-hero rides into a town that has more or less been taken over by outlaws, and in the process of defeating those outlaws, the anti-hero behaves more or less as badly as the outlaws, but there's always some degree of ethical justification for it, right? So, Boss and Amos are violent people. They are bounty hunters. They kill people consistently, etc., etc. In this sense, they are not particularly better ethically than Jed Clayton and his gang, with the exception of the people that Boss and Amos kill are outlaws, and the people that Jed Clayton and his gang kill are not. There are several more striking similarities. At one point, Boss sort of goes out to the Mexican part of this town to see a woman named Clara May, who he and Amos had sort of rescued out on the plains. Her father had been killed, and she was going to be sexually assaulted by these random cowboy thugs. Boss and Amos killed them, one of whom actually was wanted, so they got some money for that. So, but they bring her back into town, and basically she gets a job working in this cantina. And so Boss goes out to see her, and he finds this very hungry Mexican boy crying in his grandmother's arms. Boss is like, "No, son, I don't approve of this." So he takes this group of Mexican children primarily into town, into the white part of town. He goes to the general store, and he basically just starts taking stuff out of the general store and giving it to these children, essentially. And the store owner is like, hey, who's going to pay me for all this stuff? You're taking all my goods and shit. And Boss is like, tell it to the mayor. So, I mean, it is this sort of fun, since the white townsfolk have been quite racist and generally pretty horrible to Boss and Amos. There is that sort of, again, element of empowerment, but it is also this weird moment where, like, to save my store from Jed Clayton and his dudes looting it, I'm gonna allow Boss to loot it on behalf of the Mexican population of this town. And again, there is that sort of that element of justice to it, right? That this guy has a bunch of stuff, these people need stuff, and so I'm going to appropriate it. There's something Robin Hood-esque about it. But from the perspective of, like, law, from the perspective of, I don't want to say justice because that's a squishier concept, but from the perspective of, is what we're getting better than what we're trying to avoid, it's not necessarily clear that Boss and Amos are better for the town than Jed Clayton. I'll throw this out there. The other thing that is better about Boss and Amos is that they don't really want to stay. Once they get Jed and get the money for him, they want to leave. Whereas Jed and his gang seem to want to continue returning to this place and basically using it as a supply depot continually. So there's that. That is a substantial difference, I suppose. Amos, for his part, as the deputy, puts up a set of black laws, basically just a set of rules that he and Boss have come up with. So it's things like you can't call them the N-word without either a $20 fine or 2 days in jail, I think is what it is. Disturbing the peace is on there. So they just come up with all these laws, and basically Amos just sort of uses the arbitrary enforcement of these laws on the white citizens of this town in order to basically enrich himself. Basically, he just wants to collect fines from people. And so again, he does this in this sort of charming way where it is very much a sort of bottom rails on top type ethos to it, but from the perspective of the citizenry, it's not clear that having their money taken by Amos for fines is much better than having their money taken by Jed and his men for robbery. So it is interesting, and I say that not to sort of single this movie out, right? Boss is not unique in this way. This is very much a sort of spaghetti Western and 1960s, 70s Western, the anti-hero Western trope tends to include these things, right? Like, you go back and watch a lot of Clint Eastwood's movies from the Man with No Name era, the Sergio Leone era, etc. His behavior is often horrific. But again, this is one of those things, right? So, ultimately, yeah, you've got the sort of standard type storyline where Jed gets the upper hand. It looks like everything's going to go bad for Boss and Amos, but then they have an incredibly unlikely gunfight where their substantially outnumbered forces manage to gun down all the bad guys in the streets. And finally, Boss and Jed individually square off, and they have the sort of final fight, right, in which Boss kills Jed. Great. Cool, good stuff. The other thing I want to talk about is the women in this movie, because there's two main female characters. There's Clara May, and there is Miss Pruitt. So Clara May, as I had said, she had been traveling with her father, who gets killed by these bandits. She's about to be sexually assaulted. She's saved by Boss and Amos. I don't think I mentioned this. Clara May is African American. That's, I think, an important element of what I'm about to say. So Clara May comes back into town, gets this job, etc., etc. At one point, the mayor attempts to rape her. She defends herself with a knee to the balls. Good work. She is then later kidnapped by Jed Clayton and his dudes because they know that Boss is her friend and they want to draw him out. It is heavily implied that she's raped by Jed. So that is our one main female character. She also really likes Boss. She's into Boss. It's not clear how much he likes her as such. Like, obviously he has affection for her, but it's not clear that, like, he might want to marry her or something like that. The other major female character is Miss Pruitt. She is the white school teacher who has moved to this town from Boston. The first time that she meets Boss and Amos is very uncomfortable because she's basically like, hey, back in Boston, I knew a bunch of black people and they loved to dance and sing and I really enjoyed watching that. And Boss and Amos are like, wow, awkward. And it is very awkward. I don't know if it was awkward in 1975, but it's awkward in 2025. But she basically, falls in love with Boss and is like trying to be with him. This is the mid-1900s, late 1900s rather. Amos makes mention of having been a slave, so this is not that far from 1865. That is not really a relationship that would work out well on the frontiers of America. So there is this sort of competition for Boss's affection between Clara May and Miss Pruitt. I do think it is striking that Miss Pruitt is very sort of upstanding and never faces any sort of sexual violence. Boss does kiss her at one point, but that's it. Whereas the African-American woman, Clara May, is repeatedly subjected to or threatened with sexual violence. We get a scene of her taking a bath. I think it is very striking that we have a dramatic difference in the presentation of not really the sexuality of Clara May, but Clara May as object for men versus Miss Pruitt as object for men. It is a very striking difference. That one of them is sort of chaste-ish, right? Like, she desires Boss, but Boss is very accurately like, as an African-American man in the 19th century, I have enough problems. I don't really need a white woman following me around. He doesn't quite say it that way, but that is essentially the gist of his ultimate rebuff of her. So like she desires him, but there is a sort of chasteness about her in the film that Clara May clearly is not afforded. And I think it is striking which of these two women is allowed not to be the subject of sexual violence and which is not. The other thing I want to mention about this just I found very, very odd. When Boss and Amos arrive in this town, frontier town, it seems that almost no one has ever seen an African American before. Amos initially confronts these two guys who are messing with this Mexican woman. Like, she's a laundry woman, and they're like taking some of the clean clothes she's washed, and they're like unfolding them, throwing them on the ground. And Amos is basically like, "Hey, stop, or I'm gonna shoot you." So again, good for him. And they're basically like, "Oh, I've heard of black people, but I've never seen one." And that's so odd. I mean, because given how many people on the American frontiers came from the southern United States after the Civil War, because there was very little economic opportunity in the South, and so a lot of people went west looking for opportunities. And given that at least a third of the cowboys in the Old West, like trapper cowboys, people who worked with cattle and drove them over long distances, at least a third of them were African American historically. And given that Clara May and her father had been living in this town, it seems very odd that the people in this town are like, "What? Black people? What a novelty. I've never seen this before, but also I'm pretty racist." I mean, I think the way to sort of make sense of this is the American frontier of Hollywood, particularly from the 40s, 50s, 60s into the 70s. The American frontier was a very white place, much more white than it was historically.